Hey, folks, welcome to Friendly Orbit, the podcast that draws us together no matter how far we fly. I'm Ceres, symmetrical and superior, and joined this week by.
Always hard and ready for a payoff. It's Theia.
That's disgusting.
What are you talking about? We are talking about hard versus soft magic systems today.
We're talking about Brandon Sanderson, apparently, more specifically.
Yes, we're talking about the Brandon Sanderson, or Brando Sando for the real fans, which we are since approximately 3 months.
Yeah, I mean, I've
Probably
only read
less.
three. I've only read 3 of the books, and I'm not very far in the 3rd book. But it's good so far. I'm enjoying myself, but I'm not very far yet.
Yes, for those who don't know, Brandon Sanderson is a very prolific sci-fi and fantasy author, and he's very well known for his very methodical approach to world building and magic systems. So much so that he has developed his own rules to write magic in a satisfying way, both from a narrative payoff perspective, but also in a way that it makes sense in the worlds that he writes. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. So let's get into it.
Ignition sequence start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff.
All right, so tell us about hard versus soft magic systems.
All right. So
What's the difference?
Generally, a hard magic system is a magic system that has well-defined rules that the reader or that the audience understands, and the rules the magic system behaves in a predictable, consistent way. And
Think Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. I mean, I probably
spells always require spell slots. They always have specific ranges. They always work the same way. You can't just Misty Step 700 feet if you want to. It's always 30 feet.
For sure. That's a very good description. Think maybe something you might be more familiar with: Avatar: The Last Airbender. Bending is generally very consistent. Of course, this magic system is not always hard or always soft. There's a spectrum. For example, in the case of Avatar, there is a hard magic system, which is bending, but all the magic that is related to the spirit world is very soft, very mysterious.
Yep.
And so the counter side to hard magic system are soft magic systems, which often are better at inspiring awe or horror by being inconsistent, unpredictable, or completely impossible to understand for the audience. And
do you have an example for a soft magic system?
The way that most of the magic in Lord of the Rings works is soft. For example, Gandalf's magic or the Maiar's magic in general is pretty soft. They can do what they need to be able to do at a certain point in the story, but the conflict is never solved by Gandalf waving a stick, saying the spell, and the problem is solved. And here we kind of get into Rule 1. An author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic.
Yeah, I remember this rule. I got this in a YouTube short.
Yeah, this one is you're well studied. The algorithm has predicted this. Predicted this episode. It knows
exactly.
Yeah. So essentially, you don't want to have a Deus Ex Machina. So if you want the magic to solve the problem, then you need to set it up early.
And again, this is Brandon Sanderson's law. How many laws does he have?
3 plus a 0th law, which is more a joke. 3 rules are the real rules, and one of them is just wink, wink.
So his first law makes sense to me, right? When he's talking about magic paying off like in a satisfying way,
Mhm.
right? A mystery is satisfying when you could have figured out the answer. Not necessarily that
Exactly.
you did, but you had the feeling that you could. And maybe if there's like a distribution of readers, maybe like half of them see it coming and half of them don't, or something like that. But like something that you could have never known, that nobody could have guessed, doesn't really feel satisfying because you're not really being challenged. Like, it's a fun little game when a book challenges you to pay attention,
Yeah.
right? When a book presents you with two pieces of information that appear to be contradictory, and you think to yourself, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense, and you think about it and you try to make sense of it. In a similar sense, if magic just arbitrarily can't help in a given situation or arbitrarily
Mhm.
can help in a given situation, it's not fun. What's fun is if you are able to figure out how magic could help in a situation, right? The space in between.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And so often soft magic is better at just creating sort of like setting a mood, at at generating like an emotional response from the reader, but not at solving the problem. And that's, for example, how in Lord of the Rings, the one thing that is solved by, let's call it, magic rules, is set up very early. That the ring can only be destroyed by throwing it into Mount Doom. That's how you solve the problem. How do they solve it? By throwing it into Mount Doom.
Yeah.
It's not exactly a mystery, but it establishes the rule very early on, and then it pays it off. And Brandon Sanderson also talks about how really like fantasy and sci-fi here are one and the same, in the sense that they both are set in kind of other worlds, which may be more or less similar to ours, but to a certain degree they differ. And in sci-fi, it's the same thing. If the sci-fi elements that one adds to the story are explained thoroughly and are consistent, and then they can be used to solve to bring upon the solution to the story. While if they are not, then of course it it then they cannot. Like for example, I mean, I find
I
it
have
I
I
find
have
it
an
hard.
example that I'm
Yeah.
curious about your opinion on, because I think it fits into this mold. Okay. So it's actually two examples. It's comparing two examples. It's the moment in Three Body Problem when they use the nanofibers to attack the ship, compared to the moment in Star Wars where they turn the ship to FTL drive and kamikaze bomb it into a Star Destroyer.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I don't know. Would you call the second one a failure of a hard rule, or a soft magic moment where it's like, this is awesome, and it doesn't really matter if it contradicts what we said before?
So I think
What's your take?
yeah, so I'm interested. So just to give a little bit of context to the readers, the Three Body Problem is a very grounded sci-fi story that takes place in the 21st century that we would very much recognize. And the protagonist of the story is a nanofiber expert scientist. And there's a part in the story where, without giving too many spoilers, they all of a sudden use these nanofibers and they string them across a shipping canal, and a ship goes through the fibers and gets sliced apart and destroyed into Swiss cheese. And it's, a very surprising moment, but we know how nanofibers work. The way nanofibers work is explained to us, and we know that the protagonist has access to nanofibers. And so because it's a grounded world, I would argue that this is satisfying because it's something you could have seen coming. Whereas there is a really cool, but I would say not really satisfying moment in one of the sequel Star Wars movies. I think it's the 8th one.
Yes, it is The Last Jedi, the most controversial Star Wars movie
Yeah,
ever,
in the
apparently.
Last Jedi. And Star Wars is a universe in which technology is not really described in a hard way. It's all like techno babble, and like random terms that are thrown in. And generally speaking, the technology is not described in detail. It just works, right? So that would be the equivalent of a soft magic system or a soft
I
technology
have
system.
actually. I want. Maybe this is a good time to bring up a distinction.
Yeah.
That he talks about kind of like external versus internal logic, where external logic is maybe what you are talking about. For example, when we say that um, when someone tries to use outside real world science to
Mm-hmm.
justify how a system works, that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of external logic. But external
Mm-hmm.
logic doesn't make a hard magic system, or in the lack of external logic doesn't make a system soft. For
Mm-hmm.
example, how does bending work? Bending is never explained. There is never an explanation for it, just as much as there is no explanation for how tech works in Star Wars. But
Yeah.
it is consistent and it has logic.
And it
Superman
has
gets his
rules to
power.
it, right?
Exactly. Superman gets his powers from the sun. He gets to shoot lasers because of our sun and to fly. How does that
Right.
work? It doesn't matter, but the rules are there. So the Superman's superpowers are still a hard magic system, even
Yeah.
though they don't bother to explain it. I would argue that in Star Wars we have seen enough of fast light travel that we know the rules.
Well, so the way that the moment works, right? What happens here in this moment is that there's a giant star destroyer that we have no chance of possibly defeating. So one character heroically vacates, has everybody leave the ship that they're on, and then powers the ship that they're on at light speed into the star destroyer, destroying it, right? And this is the first time in the series that faster than light travel is ever used offensively as a weapon, right? To crash something into something else going faster than light. And this was a moment that was created a lot of buzz at the time. People were like, oh, da da da. Was it cool? Was it not cool?
But everyone
I
got over it, and now everyone's cool with it, right?
no, I
That's
don't
what
think
happened.
so. I don't think everyone got over it and is cool with the movie
Why?
now.
Star Wars fans are such a rational, calm group, a community.
A calm group. They would never overreact. But I would argue it's a moment that's cool, but not satisfying. And so if you're not here for the vibes, I don't think you're going to enjoy it, because it establishes while it doesn't violate a rule of faster than light travel that's ever stated earlier in the series, it violates implicitly the fact that you would ever use anything else for warfare. There's many objectives from earlier in the series that this idea violates. Why would you not take a random X-Wing, put a droid on it, and have it go at faster than light speed into a Death Star? I'm sure if you did that 7 times, the Death Star would probably explode, right? Or why don't you use it on Star Destroyers all the time? So
I was gonna say,
feels
it's
to
not
me
like this,
maybe it's sorry.
It's not like the entire saga is predicated on destroying very large vehicles. Very large flying vehicles. That's the whole thing. That's all they do. You can't just.
So it feels to me it's when I say the technology of Star Wars is technobabble, I mean it is true, it doesn't work in our reality, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is it's never important. Nobody's ever oh, I'm gonna build a droid that can think for itself, and they go, no, you can't do that because of the Butlerian Jihad or whatever, right? Or you never have a moment where someone's like, I'm gonna make a ship that goes 7 times light speed, and they go, no, you can't do that because of this intricate technology system that we invented, right? The technology generally in Star Wars is kind of just it works. It's never really described. They never really get into it and get into the nuances and the rules of it. So suddenly using it and being well, if you think about it, faster than light is a lot of momentum, and a lot of momentum using a ship as a missile, would create a lot of damage if you think about it. I think that's what makes it unsatisfying. Is the solution is never really supposed to be fully according to his law, his rule, your ability to solve this problem of the giant ship with technology is limited because we haven't really foreshadowed the rules of faster than light travel very much, and it's never been particularly important what exactly the rules of technology are. I feel like these are two contrasting moments that show a world with a soft technology sci-fi system, Star Wars, where the payoff is technology, and it doesn't fully work, at least not for everybody, right? And whereas in Three Body Problem, a world where the technology is super rules oriented and is very hard, having the twist be a technological solution to a problem, it feels really great. It feels right at home.
Yeah. It's a little bit as if in Legend of Korra, when faced with Amon, who has stolen her ability to bend. Spoiler. Korra just pulled out a Glock and shot him in the head. I was like, well, yeah, okay. You know? Okay, Korra, I can see how the technology of this time would allow for Korra to pull out her massive Glock and
Yeah.
go, hey, Amon, bend me this one. And then...
Bend this. Bend
bend
this, casual.
bitch. You filthy casual. Yeah, exactly. But that would raise up so many questions and be very disappointing as a payoff.
I mean, I think it's just like it sets the expectation for the kind of narrative it is. A narrative in which magic or technology works in a very particular way and has very particular rules is a system in which a trick involving an interaction of those rules feels cool and feels satisfying, you know? Whereas in a system where magic is kind of just there for a sense of awe and a sense of like the unknown and the sense of mystery, having it be the solution feels kind of lazy because you could always do that. Like you could literally use it whenever you wanted to use it as an author, and you could just say, oh, it doesn't work whenever you don't want it to work as an author.
Yeah. One final thought, and then we can move on. I think that this first thought is basically just like a more convoluted or like a more specific way of saying that like to solve problems in a satisfying way, you need good setup and payoff. And which also means that you can apply this rule actually not only to supernatural forces, but also to like rules, real world rules that most people simply wouldn't know. For example, I have an example here to contrast the rules of finance and of like the politics of corporations and stock exchanges and stuff like that. In The Wolf of Wall Street, it is important to understand how the protagonist makes his money, to understand kind of like how corrupt it is. And it's important to understand why he gets in trouble at the end. And so we need to spend some time explaining, you know, like how does he even make his money? We need to understand
what's wrong about it for it to make sense to us that he gets arrested at the end, and to understand that he's a bad guy in the story, not a good guy.
Conversely, in a story where there is a very wealthy main character, but the wealth is entirely here for the vibes and the feelings, is 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah, or Batman.
Or Batman. But I like more 50 Shades of Grey. But, you know.
Yeah, no, I think you're right? Like you need to set up and pay off.
Nobody cares why Christian Grey is rich. We only care that he can buy us a helicopter and that we can pretend that we didn't want it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right? Like I think generally it's just like for a payoff to feel satisfying. The more general version of this would be to say for a payoff to feel satisfying, you have to establish the components you're going to use for the payoff and then use them in an interesting way during the payoff.
Exactly.
Right.
And if you're going to write a story about like maybe a specific profession or set in a specific setting that most people are not familiar with, you only really need to explain this world thoroughly if you want the rules of this world to be important to like the plot advancement and solving the problems. Christian Grey's money serves us so that we can have scenes, so that we can travel to Italy and we can have a helicopter ride. We don't need it to actually solve any problems, because the problems are relationship problems.
Yeah, I think you're right. One last example that comes to mind for like hard versus soft world building is in the Aragon series. Within the series, there's a hard and a soft magic system. So the hard magic system is predicated on the idea that you have to expend energy to produce magical effects, and like so if you create a fire out of magic, it literally draws the metabolic energy from your body to create the fire. Like you get hungry, you get cold, you burn fat, right, to sustain this fire. And if you let it go on too long, it kills you, right? And then you regulate these energy with carefully worded grammatical spells, basically, but they're sentences in an elder language. And it's very like programming-esque, and then the power source is your physical body's energy. But dragons in this magic system, while they still kind of draw on the same energy, they don't cast spells like that. They don't just say what they want to have happen in the world and it happens, manifesting the magical force of their body. Dragon magic is sort of explicitly described as being very powerful, very subtle, and very unpredictable, though. And the dragons themselves can't control it. It's just like when the moment is right, they can create these powerful magical effects without even intending to, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, oh, okay, the dragon riders, right? They have like this hard magic, but then every once in a while, when there's a really big, important, special moment, when a character earns redemption, or when the moment is just right, then a dragon can do a special magical effect. But they won't be able to like repeat it easily and stuff like that.
Yeah, that sounds about perfectly encapsulating what we're talking about here. Yeah, I think that's great. Let's move on to number 2.
Okay.
Limitations are more interesting than powers.
Yeah.
Here, this is kind of like the idea that, the more powers you give to a character, the more they'll just be able to solve, the harder it will be to challenge them. He brings up a lot Superman here, and why it's difficult to write a good Superman story.
Mm-hmm.
And because with Superman, it's either you need to get the kryptonite, or you need to find something that punches stronger than Superman.
Or you just have to make the story not about being strong.
Yeah, I was about to say, most of the good stories tell stories where the problem is not like a bad guy.
The problem is like, how do I belong in society? Or
or how do I
deal with bigotry? Right, like you can't punch bigotry out of the country.
Yeah, how do I?
You can't laser it away.
Yeah, how do I keep my moral system intact if nobody holds me accountable? Because nobody can, because I'm Superman.
Yeah.
So yeah, exactly. So limitations stronger than powers. He brings up a really interesting example about how he kind of like someone brought up to him the idea that he thought his magic system for I don't remember the name of Mistborn, Elemency, the magic of metals, was cool, and somebody said it's just like a world full of magnetos. And then he went his first reaction was like, oh my god, it is a world full of magnetos, am I a hack? But then he also thought, it's of course there are similarities, but people in Mistborn can't do a lot of things that Magneto can do. And then he thought about how Magneto is more interesting than Jean, because Jean is just a telekinetic who can move anything, but Magneto has to be limited by metal. And that's interesting, because then you can build a prison for him made out of plastic. And then Mystique has to inject the guy with iron in his blood for Magneto to pull out in one of the coolest movies in a superhero movie ever. And you can't have that with Jean. With Jean, she would just like be on drugs or killed by Wolverine.
Yeah, I mean, it just takes like it adds an additional wrinkle, and I think it's just particularly interesting if it's a limitation that people are used to from real life, like a limitation that feels relatable to some degree. Like magnets. Like we all know magnets are interesting and powerful, but the fact that they only affect certain metals is very intuitive. That's how magnetism works. We're all used to that. We've all played with magnets as kids, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I think Magneto's limitation is particularly interesting. And I think limitations like powers can help make a character more unique, but if you add too many of them together, they just kind of become like super great at most stuff, right? Whereas limitations really have the ability to define a character. Like, this character is an amazing acrobat and a really good hand-to-hand combat fighter, but he's blind, right? And it's like, that's really interesting, right? And that's Daredevil, right? And I think that's why Daredevil is more interesting than most of the other like defenders, right?
Yeah.
Like Jessica Jones is really strong and resistant. Luke Cage is really strong and resistant. Iron Fist, stop me if you've heard this before, is really strong and resistant, But Daredevil has a genuine weakness and strength, right? He has some things he's incredibly good at and some things he's really bad at. And so there's like it adds this wrinkle to the narrative that can really sort of change the dynamic of a situation.
Yeah.
It reminds me tangentially of a truism of game design that I've heard, Mark
Mhm.
Rosewater say, who's the head designer of Magic. One of the things he says all the time is restrictions breed creativity.
Yeah.
Like when they're designing a Magic set and they're like, oh, well, we're designing a Magic set, but we want it to be reminiscent of Greek mythology. And we want it to also have a theme that focuses on one specific card type, right? Those restrictions actually breed creative ways to find the solutions. Well, how could this card type represent the mythology of a Greek pantheon, right? And that's
Yeah.
how they came up with the enchantment theme of Theros and the devotion mechanic and like other stuff that was cool. But like
Yeah.
it's something that he says over and over, and I think that's true, right? If you set up a character with powers and you give them certain restrictions, it breeds creativity in the sense that it forces you to get creative with that character in the way that you solve problems. And creative problem solving is inherently more satisfying than straightforward problem solving, right? Like that's why we're reading a story.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And yeah. So yeah, pretty much you summed it
Counterpoint.
up. I think yeah.
What if the power is really sick though? What if it's a dope ass power? Like what if
What
it's a
if-
power that's inherently like you know what I mean? Like what if it's a power that like couldn't you argue that what makes Magneto interesting is the power to magnetically move things?
Yeah, I mean,
Right?
what makes Magneto interesting is that he gets to magnetically move metals, and that's
Yeah.
really cool.
The fact that he can't move other stuff is also cool, but like you
also
kind of want a primary power, right? Like you want at least one power that you then get to limit.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally you need. I mean, if you're going to sell someone on the magic, it cannot suck. But it's when Captain America is really strong and resistant, but then he's facing a flying enemy, he needs to get creative.
Yeah.
And
Like
he can still be awesome at fighting in hand-to-hand combat and be unmatched in that. But that's where, for example, Superman is like, oh no, he can also fly. He can also shoot lasers. So really, he doesn't have to fly. He can just zap you out of the sky. And he can also...
do you know that whole thing about how he like only flies because it was easier to animate?
Oh, I didn't
Like
know
Superman
that.
used to jump.
I know that. I didn't know that the reason he started flying was because it was easier to animate.
Yeah, like the first TV show they did for him, they were like, the jumping is too much. We just want to be able to like, take the outline of him and move it across the screen.
Animators, they get paid so much, and I think that they're lazy.
No.
Yes.
That's not what you think.
That is what I think. I think that the animators of Across the Spider-Verse should have been squeezed harder.
Harder, yeah. Oh, sure.
Yeah. No, it's...
I would kind of argue that the middle ground, obviously I'm a renowned fantasy author as well, so my advice matters. But I would argue the middle ground you kind of want to aim for is theoretically invincible. And what I mean by theoretically invincible is like you hear the power set of this character and you're like, wow, that's crazy. How's anyone going to beat this dude up? And it's like, well, caveat, this is the one thing they can't handle, right? Or they can't do this, right? So
I think that's a little bit...
It wants to feel like on first consideration, like, wow, this is really strong and this seems really cool. But then on second thought, you start to think about like scenarios, but what if they're in this situation? How do they get out of that one, right? Well, what if they're in this situation? How do they get out of that one? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I can see that. I would also argue, like, I think that like theoretically invincible, I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of wrinkles in that thing. Like I think there's a lot of powers which are like small enough that like nobody would think you'd be invincible. But they're interesting. They're interesting powers. For example, I think that like you haven't seen Death Note, but Death Note is interesting the way that like Death Note lets you have a lot of power, but under very specific conditions, and only if you have the Death Note. So actually disabling you and taking that power away from you is very easy, unless you're very good at hiding it.
That's for me a power that totally fits the paradigm of what I mean by theoretically invincible. You think about it the first time and you're like, well, if anyone tries to take it from you, you just write their name in the book. So no one can ever touch you. No one will ever get to you, right? And then you go, well, I mean, think about it. You have to sleep at some point. And
Also,
what if you don't know their name?
You have to know the guy's name. Exactly.
Exactly. What if you don't? And then so it's like I think something cool to aim for is a power that at first blush feels really strong, and then has a significant amount of limitations that you can come up with actually quite a few scenarios in which like it's not ideal.
Yeah.
Like in Brandon Sanderson's books, we have shard bearers, right? Which are these people who wear like this. It's kind of like a power armor. It's all magic, but it works a lot like a power armor in the sense that it makes you stronger and faster and you can jump really far. And then they have these swords that can cut through literally anything. And like if they cut through a part of your body, they just like sever the nerves in that part of your body. So like they cut through your spinal cord, you just die. That's obviously not the exact same thing as what happens in our world with a spinal cord injury, but you know, it's similar. And then if like they cut through like your
sever
arm,
your soul from your body.
Exactly. If they cut through your arm, you can't use your arm. If they cut through your leg. And so these people, like at first blush, you're like, wow, these guys, like, how would you ever defeat them on a battlefield? But then they're actually like, you think about it, it's like, well, what if I can fly? What if you fall a great distance, right? Like, what if I push you off a cliff? He includes that the armor sort of has to be powered by these gemstones and by the light inside the gemstones. And so when the armor starts breaking, it starts losing power, which means it might, at some point, you start off super strong. Eventually, you get to your normal level, but then it can drag you even below that because it's so heavy, right? And if it like has nothing in it, it can pin you to the ground. So I think that's kind of like, I think that's a good place to aim for, right?
Yeah.
It's like, yes, restrictions are more interesting in powers, but you do kind of want a cool power to begin with that feels kind of like, wow, that's really strong.
But I think the problem for most writers that they come up with a power that is too strong or too cool. Yeah. Nobody ever comes up with like a lame power full of limitations. I was like, but what if it was better? Exactly. It's always like, you know,
this guy can heat coffee to sub-boiling degrees.
Yeah.
This is my awesome power. Now I need to come up with a meaningful limitation. How do I?
Exactly.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, I wanted to say, like, I think an interesting example of like, we brought up Superman. I think a character who is kind of overpowered, but people don't really think about him as overpowered, is Spider-Man.
I agree.
Spider-Man is really strong, really agile. He literally has like a spider senses that warn him of impending danger. Yeah. He has a lot of air mobility. Like he may not be able to fly, but rarely is the problem with Vulture that he cannot get up that high, because between spider webs, like swinging and being able to like literally like hit someone with spider webs and drag them down, he can. Yeah. He has a lot of ability there, and
you can't surprise him. That's
you literally
the big part.
That's the best part. That was also interesting. Yeah, that's what Venom is good at, because like Venom, one of the things, I don't know if you know it, but Venom doesn't trigger the spider sense.
Oh, cool. No,
because like it was attached to him, so it's like it's similar. The spider sense doesn't ping on Venom, but when so
and Spider-Man's story if all of that wasn't enough, Peter Parker is also a genius.
Yeah, I was about to say he's also very smart, a genius eventually because of like brain power creep of all comics. Exactly. But so a lot of Spider-Man stories, like a big part of Spider-Man is like his personal life and his personal problems.
That's his limitation.
Yeah,
he has no money and no time.
Yeah, an elderly aunt.
Exactly.
My weakness is kryptonite. Like, I think, what's yours? My aunt.
Yeah, I mean,
I think wants me to be worried if I get home too late.
Yeah, for real. Like, I think one of his main limitations is that he just has like no time, because he's constantly like has to do work for school and has to do, this internship and has to do that and has to take pictures for the Daily Bugle and so on and so forth. Like, I think that is honestly his main weakness, because his power set is pretty airtight. Like, sure, like if you're like a psychic, and you like mind control, that could take him out pretty easily. Time travel, the god power obviously works, right? If you're like a magician and you just like, but if like you're a physically based character, I think it's pretty hard to take on Spider-Man. I mean, maybe Spider-Man can't stop you, but it's hard to get one over on Spider-Man.
Yeah, like, I think like most of his stories are not like an enemy who is exploiting a weakness, but it's more like Spider-Man having to figure out the enemy's weakness. It's like the enemy is always like the puzzle, how do you take down Mysterio versus how do you take down the Rhino? And Spider-Man has his toolbox of abilities, and he has to figure out always which one is the right one. But then his own limitations, yeah, as we said, it's more like, I cannot fight the rhino because my aunt's in the hospital. I need to get her meds.
I think you're totally right. Actually, I think that is a big part of Spider-Man stories. I remember in the watching the '60s cartoon growing up, there was like a very common tropey moment where he was like, "Huh, I just need to write up a new web formula to solve this problem." And he would go home, he would lose the first fight, he would go home, he would make the new web formula, and he would win the second fight. And
Yeah.
that's how the 20-minute episode worked, you know? And I
Yeah.
was always interested in all the stuff they would come up with that he could do with the web formula, because it ranged from like plausible and interesting to like really bad. Like one was like, oh, this one doesn't conduct electricity, right? Another one was like, I made a speedboat out of webbing. And it's like, what the fuck are you guys on? Like, this thing had a working motor. And it was like one of those fan boats like you use in Florida to get over swamps and shit.
Like, hey, Spider-Man, Peter Parker, do you want to like patent that and like be wealthy forever?
It's just like, what the fuck? Like a speedboat in a spray can? You know what I mean? Like, what is this bullshit?
It's 3D printing. He was
Exactly.
a real ahead of his time.
Yeah,
You had something else, or do we move on? I think you had something else.
I did have one more thought. Oh, yeah, I saw a really interesting world building discussion where they were like talking about time travel powers, and like they were like, how do you make a villain who has time travel powers, but like you don't make them broken, right? And so this was a very interesting discussion of limitations, and they were like, what if they can only affect a certain area? What if they can only go back a few minutes? What if they can only go in one direction? And one of the ideas that I thought was really cool was, what if you can only go back a few minutes? Because it kind of creates this situation where the villain has to constantly evaluate whether or not to use their power or to lock in what's happened, you know? Because if they can go back an hour, or let's actually scrap that. Let's make it like 20 minutes. Let's say they can go back 20 minutes. You start a fight against the villain. You're the good guy, and you get in a grazing hit on them, and then they proceed to kick your ass for 20 minutes. And you're about to die on the 21st minute, and that's when the bad guy realizes you poisoned them on the opening cut, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, you can't go back anymore, you know? So I don't know. I just thought it was an interesting scenario we're going through, where people were like giving different suggestions of limitations the villain could have. That really made it much more interesting. Like, you know, if they can only go in one direction, well, then, you know, that opens up new opportunity. If they can only control one area, what if the good guys are a tag team duo? So then they're always trying to split up, because if they're ever in the same area, they immediately lose the fight. But if they can stay in two different areas, right, then one can always be attacking while the other one is disabled by the time magic, right?
Yeah.
Or, you know, what if you poison them? Obviously, one person recommended the bullet to the head, you know, like shoot them before they can react, weakness.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But yeah, anyways, it was just an example that came to mind where, like, you know, time travel is cool, but the limitations of the time travel are what actually gives you an interesting payoff to the character.
I mean, time travel, we always talk about it, but if you introduce like time travel without many limitations, then it becomes the only power that
only power that matters.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think Echo, for example, is an interesting case from Arcane, where he can only go back so much, or his machine will explode. And at the end,
he can only go back like 10 seconds. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I said. He can only go back so much, or his machine will explode.
Sorry,
and
I thought you meant he can only go back so many times, and then his machine explodes, which I believe is also true.
No, I don't think so.
It felt to me like it was getting more and more unstable with the Jinx / powder scene. But maybe not.
I think that's because in the beginning he was getting burned from the explosions of Jinx, you know, pulling the trigger. So he was literally burned by the several explosions he had gotten in the face. You know, at a distance, but he was still getting burned. I think that Jinx even noticed at some point when he shows up and he's kind of like smoky. But yeah. No, anyway. Yeah. And there it's also interesting because they set up that thing that like if you do it too much, then bad stuff happens. And then at the end, he does overcharge it one final time and then he throws it in Victor's face.
Yeah. I actually think this is kind of a side tangent, but in terms of game mechanics for video games, I think it's one of the coolest game mechanics you can do for a video game, because the video game is continuously tracking all the characteristics of your character that you can rewind time, like in Overwatch. You can do this with Tracer, right?
Yeah,
And it literally
exactly.
takes you back to where you were standing at the hit points you were at with like the ammunition that you had, like all your shit goes back, right?
Yeah,
And so it's like actual time travel
yeah,
that you can play in a very immersive sort of
yeah.
a
In a
medium. I always thought
single,
that's one of the coolest things that you can do because the
do,
video game is tracking everything and it
yeah.
can reset stuff like that easily.
Do you know about any single player thing that lets you do that, but like for real? Like you
Yeah,
don't just
Life is
go
Strange.
back. Oh, all right, Life is Strange. Okay, yeah, yeah. Never mind. I know that. Okay, I was thinking more of an action-oriented one, like something like Tracer. But you know, when you do it with Tracer, you're the only one who resets. Of course, it would be awful for everybody else's gaming experience. Like everyone, imagine everyone plays Tracers, and like the game just never ends. It just keeps the eight
I just
hour
like to,
game.
I just like to imagine like you're like the two Reinhardts from like opposing teams, and everyone else is playing Tracer, and like you just have this interaction where you melee the other Reinhardt to death after like 7 minutes of combat. But now for the last 20 minutes, you've just been resolving the same like melee him and he dies, melee him and he dies, and like it keeps rewinding because everywhere on the map, some random Tracer is using their ability, and it
Yeah.
affects everybody.
Yeah, but then
It's-
what if the other guy gets you this time? Because you know he knows he knows you're coming.
Exactly. No
Uh,
longer surprised. Yeah.
it becomes like hell for everybody else.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but in single player mode, you know, you could actually do that in like a shooter
Yeah.
or a combat game. Anyways,
I really like the mechanic in Life is Strange because it lets you explore like all the alternate paths, but you do
Yeah.
get locked in, you know, like
Yeah.
once you've made certain decisions, you can't go back anymore.
Yeah. All right. Rule number 3 is a rule that I think that's similar to rule 1. It's just like we can call this a rule of magic, but I think this is just like solid world building advice all in all.
Mhm.
Expand what you already have before adding something new. He here brings up specifically the magic system in Stormlight,
Okay.
where apparently originally he had conceived of like multiple magic systems coexisting all at once, while in the final product they're all kind of like tied together and they all share thematic elements, like the system of the shards and the system of surge binding and the system of fabrils are all really deriving from the same core ideas
Yeah.
in like what spren are and what you know like how the surge the surge binding and like the swearing the ideals is related to honor, who is also a spren, etc., and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, he brings up this example because he said his in original version he had so many coexisting magic systems and he thought, oh, you know, I'm gonna have so many and the readers are gonna love them. And
Yeah.
then he was like, what if I have one magic system that is like building on top of itself and is coherent within itself, but lets you do a lot of different things? And so it's kind of the idea, you know, go deep before you go wide.
Yeah.
Or as Brando would put it, girth is less important than depth.
Interesting phrasing.
Yeah, that's what he said. He said it's the girth law. The law of girth and depth.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I kind of agree with that. I think like the best worlds really know what they are about and say to you, what if this world worked exactly like a world you know, except here's my one conceit, right? And like there's sort of an elegance of economy in being able to explain everything you want to have in your world's in your settings toolbox from mostly one conceit, you know? And if you have to use multiple, then like whatever, use multiple. But I think I agree with the idea that if you can make more out of your one conceit and make more interesting stuff out of your one conceit rather than just adding arbitrarily new magic systems, there's sort of an elegance to it, and there's sort of an ease of understanding. Because like, you know, let's take Stormlight as an example. Like we're in spirit world, right? And so things kind of work in a spiritual way. They work in a spirit-y way. They work in an energy kind of way, right? If you throw in a whole different magic system that emphasizes different themes, then it's kind of like, you know, who would win in a magic fight that's like spirit-based? Well, the people with the most spirit right? People who believe in their ideals the strongest or have the most spirit energy to fuel them. In this case, that would be Stormlight, but whatever, right? It would be those people, that person would win the fight. Like, who wins the fight between the super spirity person in the spirit magic system and the earthbender? And it's like, well, it's kind of like, how much does a scissor believe in God? I don't know. It just doesn't apply, right? You start to mix concepts and mix metaphors about like the
Yes,
nature
it's
of
the eternal
magic.
fight. Yeah, it's also the discussion who would win fight between Superman and Goku, and it's like, what?
Yeah, it is kind of like that. It's like, well, they're just like not in the same setting, right? And they're just they work on different principles, they embody different things, So it's like you end up in a position where you're asking your reader nonsensical questions, right?
hmm
In a way, where because it's like, I don't know, like I feel like magic systems are to some degree like a metaphor. They somehow recapture something. They're like a metaphor in the sense that you explain something abstract, your magic system, through something intuitive, usually, right?
Yeah.
Like, do you know how surge binding works? Probably not. You just started reading this book, but you know how commitment works. You know how spirituality works. You know how faith works. Well, what if surge binding worked a little bit like that? And you'd be like, okay, I get it, right? But then you start to mix metaphors. If you start to add a bunch of different magic systems,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, the clarity of this gem makes it stronger than your belief in your ideals. And you're
Yeah.
like, what?
Yeah. And it's
Whereas if we
also
were just in gem world or just in belief world, you'd be fine.
Mhm. Yeah. And it's interesting. I want to bring, I mean, this is something that we'll discuss later, but when we talk about examples, some examples that I brought up that we can talk about, but like, I'm going to anticipate here. It's interesting how that can also change based on the assumptions that people make in the world, in the realm of sci-fi, because the realms of sci-fi is kind of like the idea of sci-fi generally, or at least of hard sci-fi, is let's go into the future and look at what could plausibly work scientifically if we had better technology.
Yeah.
So say that you had a setting that doesn't bother too much explaining the future, except, hey, we're in space, we're colonizing the universe, and we're doing like kind of like future space exploration tech, and that's the big one. And then book 2 said, and there are psychic people. Any example may ring. We have a specific one in our head, but honestly, if you read classic sci-fi, I don't know, it could be many. Like, I feel like
I've read Star Trek too.
I've read so many Phil Dick novel, like short stories, where at some point a psychic person shows up, and I'm like, what? We're talking about Mars. We're talking about like colonization of Mars. Why is there a psychic person? But in the 1960s, it was generally accepted that psychic powers would eventually manifest themselves as a step of human evolution. That's also where Scientology comes from. Just like, I'm going to throw it in there. It's an interesting Wikipedia page read.
Yeah, it's like I think it's because, when you're in the era when like psychology is a new thing, right? And like psychological powers, then, generally often what you do with sci-fi is basically take all the big headlines from the last 10 years, right? All the innovations from the last 10 years, crank them up to 11, and that's your setting, right? And so like when that back then, that was the relatable metaphor. Right?
Yeah.
You're like, oh, well, you've heard of psychology and you've heard of developments in psychic stuff. You've heard of psychics, and we still think that might be kind of scientifically supported. So you'll understand that when we're in space on Mars, psychics would naturally appear. And a reader from back then would be like, yes, this makes sense, right? But to us, it doesn't make sense because the metaphor doesn't make sense to us anymore. So it's kind of
it's interesting how also like explaining how it works can help in a way. Because now I'm thinking of another. You bring up psychology so much, and I was thinking about Brave New World. Brave New World also has some wonky ass psychology in it. That is absolutely like, hey, Pavlov and Watson are doing weird stuff with conditioning. What if you condition people and to make them do whatever you wanted to? And of course, it's ridiculous the degrees to which they push the idea of conditioning people in Brave New World. But I think that the fact that they spend time explaining how it works compared to Asimov, who just drops psychics in and is like, hey, you know this, right?
We're in genre.
Exactly, we're in genre. You got this.
This is a trope.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like it makes the difference because I think you and I also, but you in particular, were very upset about like the existence of psychics in Asimov.
Yeah.
But I don't think that you felt the same way about like the ridiculous psychology of Brave New World, which is also antiquated.
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, there's nothing that can't be better by explaining it a little bit better, except for then eventually your book is 7 million pages long. So the whole art to it is figuring out what you need to explain and what you don't need to
Yeah.
explain. And so that's where rule number 1 comes in, right? If you're going to
Mhm.
use this to solve a problem, you have to explain it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's just the
Yeah.
rule. That's just how it is. We like to
Yeah.
understand how the problem was solved or not able to be solved. You can't just say
Yeah.
it was or it wasn't.
Yeah, like Brave New World introduces its wonky psychology in chapter 1, and we spend a lot of time explaining it. So even if I'm thinking this is not how it works, I'm still like, okay, but like this is how this book is telling me that it works.
Yeah.
And then later this will be relevant. Well, in Asimov, it just comes out of nowhere in book 2. And it's like,
Yeah, no,
what?
I think you're right. Yeah, it's just the kind of thing where, like, you know, metaphors shift over time, right? And I
Yeah.
think for Isaac Asimov, it was just like if is such a natural fit, I don't even have to explain it,
Mhm.
right? Like
Yeah.
he's just a mutant and he's psychic because he's a mutant, and that just tracks, right? And like, you know, maybe if you were getting like, you know, if you were reading like a story that like Romans wrote, right? And
Mhm.
it's like, oh, you know, and then a goat walks into town and everyone runs away from the goat. If you know the goat myth of the goat you're not supposed to touch, you'd be like, yeah, obviously this tracks, right?
Yeah.
This fits in perfectly, right? Because it's like a convention of the it's a convention of the time, it's a convention of
Yeah.
the narrative. Like how Norse mythology, whenever a guy shows up with a hat and a stick, you know he's Odin, right? That's the
Yeah.
joke. That was the cultural in-joke at the time. For us, you don't get it until you've read a few of the stories. So
Yeah.
like the tongue-in-cheek doesn't quite resonate with you because the metaphor doesn't apply to you. But it's like,
No.
you know, yeah, and I think you're right. And I think it's
Yeah.
interesting. I haven't considered, or maybe not in detail, I hadn't considered this idea, but I think it's an interesting idea. Magic systems are often explained via metaphor, by taking a theme that the reader knows and using it to explain the abstract concept, which is
Yeah.
magic in your fantasy setting.
And
right?
also, it's sometimes sci-fi compared to magic. It doesn't bother explaining certain things because it presumes culturally that the reader understands that this is what we think will be possible in the future.
Yeah.
So I don't have to explain to you, you know, the colony on Mars too much for you to buy
Yeah.
into it and to be like, this makes sense. But
Yeah.
the psychic stuff is just like weird by today's standard. Anyways, I think we strove a little bit off topic,
Sure.
as always. Yeah. So
those are our 3 laws. Can
yeah.
we recapitulate them briefly? Your ability
Yes.
to solve problems is proportional to the amount of foreshadowing that you do, basically.
It's basically how well the reader understands said magic.
Okay.
So
yeah.
the ability to solve conflicts with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean that like you still can't use magic to like drive the plot. Gandalf's magic is often driving the plot. For example, in the encounter with the Balrog, we don't need to understand how Gandalf's magic worked to be in awe at him stopping the Balrog. But of course, the problem that he solves is first had already mostly been solved in the sense that they were trying to escape the mines and they were almost out. And then second, that Gandalf dies. So
Yeah,
it
I mean,
doesn't
I
really
feel like
solve.
I feel like it's not really the greatest example because it's a
Yeah.
little bit the waters are a little bit muddy. But the
Sure.
point is, like, magic can still can drive your narrative, regardless of how well explained it is. Like the need to learn magic drives Harry Potter. But if you wanted to solve specific problems, if you want to understand why Harry can beat Voldemort, then you need to understand how the spells work and how they interact with one another and what the rules are for
And
the
in Harry
situation.
Potter,
Otherwise,
they
it won't feel
always
satisfying.
Yeah, I think in Harry Potter, I only watched the movies, but I always found out that from the point of view of mysteries, they did a good job at bringing up the exact like magic tools that will be used to solve the problem throughout the story. You know, with the classes, they're like, okay, this is a werewolf, and then later you're like, oh, this guy's a werewolf. I know the rules, and maybe werewolves will never come up ever again in the story. But for the books that they are within, he actually brings up J.K. Rowling as someone who does this well within the books, but kind of loses the thread over the series.
I think she violates his third law, right? Instead of
Yeah.
building on the spiders and centaurs in book 1, or the invisibility cloak in book 1, or
the invisibility cloak comes back. I think the time turner is the most absurd.
That's the thing. That's what I was gonna say, right? Like, instead of building on like werewolves and spiders and centaurs and polyjuice potions, right? All of a sudden in book 4, it's just like time turners. Time travel is just a thing, and people use it to make sure they attend more classes. And it's just like, what the hell is going on, right? And then like book 5 is like, well, but what if this other technology? And book 6 is like, what if everyone could teleport at all times? Yeah, that's always been a thing in this setting.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. But do we still have a train that brings us there? We have a magic portal that brings you to a special train station to take a train to go to the school instead of just making the magic portal to the school.
We send letters.
Got it.
This is a setting where people send letters.
With owls.
You could just show up in the front door and be like, hey, by the way, I wanted to say I have to cancel for Tuesday. Alrighty, see ya.
Yeah. And like, since we're on this tangent, it's crazy to me that then she bothered to go out of her way to go like, but magic cannot make food, so we need a whole class of like elves who work underground to make food, and we just teleported to like the canteen. I was like, why?
Yeah, but
was that going to break your world?
Yeah, but I think it's true. Like, she does come up with a lot of random stuff, like randomly ghosts, randomly polyjuice potions, randomly time turners, randomly gillyweed, randomly like, you know what I mean? Like,
stuff tends to add
randomly dementors, right? Like, every book just invents what it needs for its own climax.
Yeah, but like, no, but I'm always baffled by the choice of making food a limitation, because I cannot imagine a single book where being able to make food with magic would solve the problem.
I think she just wanted to justify slavery of the elves.
I don't think so.
Because like, she goes out of her way to justify like, oh yeah, the slavery of the house elves is good. The house elves like it. It's better for them. When they're not slaves, they become drunken and indolent. It's like, oh my God, lady, Jesus Christ. When was this written? 1784? Like, what's going on?
The 1980s of the past 2 centuries ago. Yeah. All right. Well,
but okay. So that was the second. Wait, no, that was only the first.
We're still in roulette. Row 2. Limitations are more interesting than powers.
Yeah,
and
makes
then
sense.
Finally,
mostly agree with that.
Yeah, and then expand what you already have before adding something new.
Seems like good advice.
Yeah, and then there's the 0th law, which I alluded to, which to him it's the rule of cool. It's always err on the side of what is awesome. I think that's interesting because what you said about the Star Wars faster than light RAM scene is that it's awesome, but it kind of breaks the world. And like, his general advice is always err on the side of what is awesome. But in this case, I'm like, I mean, maybe this case it was not a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it depends, but I think it's, basically a more general form of this piece of advice is there's no 3 rules that guarantee you to always have a satisfying story, right?
Yeah.
These are general trends that an expert in his field has identified that can help guide you towards a solution. But truly, the solution to what is the perfect story hasn't been cracked, and in a way can't be cracked, right? And so it's like, look, if all the heuristics are telling you this doesn't work, but the actual like reality of your feeling about the story and the feeling of your readers is telling you this really does work, then that might just be a shortcoming of the heuristics, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yes.
If you come up with something that violates like Law 2, but is really freaking dope, right? And everybody who reads it loves it, then, then Law 2 is a heuristic and it can only take you so far, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, now that you brought up the word heuristic, which will definitely like speak to our audience and like not make this a very niche conversation to follow at all.
I
I
if you don't
find
know
it
what the
once.
word heuristic is, which is I think you probably do know what the word heuristic is, so please don't feel insulted. But if you don't know what it is, briefly, it's a rule that helps you do something but isn't always right. Right?
It's an approximation that is better than that is
Yeah.
much faster than doing it. Let's call it the right way, or
Yeah.
like the theoretically correct way.
It's
Eh,
like, if you ever like gone grocery shopping regularly and you're like, yeah, we always need a carton of eggs every week. So I always just buy a carton of eggs every time I go grocery shopping. I go grocery shopping once a week. I need one carton a week approximately. So I always just buy a carton. That's a heuristic, right?
Yeah.
Because on Easter week, you might need 2, right? Or following Easter week, you might only need 0, right?
Yeah.
But, generally speaking, it's a shorthand, right?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Ceres, once again, we mostly agree, and our conversation are just us agreeing and nodding along as the other one
And
speaks.
giving examples.
And giving examples. I hope that my next segment will maybe bring us to actually disagree for once.
All right. We'll see. If such a thing can happen.
Yes.
I think what might happen is that we disagree, and then you make a good point, and I say, all right, you're right. And then we start to agree again, unfortunately. I think that might happen.
Is this secretly the Healthy Conflict Resolution podcast? Should we do this?
Genuinely, I'm thinking in the back of my head, I've been like I should try one week to engineer an artificially contentious episode. Like, I should try to figure out how to make the most disagreeable episode possible on this podcast so that we finally disagree with something on air.
Yeah. Welcome to a friendly orbit. Today is Theia a whack ass person. Discuss.
Theia a sick fuck. Let's debate. So I think all right, I'm sorry. Hit me with the examples, right? That's what's going to be controversial now?
Basically, what I'm going to bring up is a series. Yeah, I'm going to basically soft and hard magic system. We said it's a spectrum, and they're not real categories. They're just helpful, as most categories of anything are. But here, let's ignore that for a moment, and let's try to find the correct answer to how hard and how soft are the magic systems of the following intellectual properties that I will bring up.
All right, do we have a metric, like 1 to 5 or something?
No, I don't think that. I think that metrics. You know what? Metrics would be a great way to disagree, but I think that. All right, you know what? Yeah, hell yeah, this is the plan all along. Edit this. Edit the scissors. The invisible hand of the scissors gonna cut this now. I know. So hard or soft? Let's go. First one is a darling to this channel, Arcane.
Arcane.
I want to hear your opinion first because I have had this is the first one that came up into my mind. This was actually the episode originally, dissecting the magic system of Arcane. But then I thought it was more interesting to talk about Brandon Sanderson's rules of magic. Anyway, you go first because I already have thoughts.
All right, I'm going to make a division. I'm going to say Shimmer and Hextech are not the same thing. So I'm going to give a different rating to each of those magic systems, right? Hextech is a 2. As in, it is almost as soft as it can be. Shimmer is a 1. And the magic system that Mel uses is a 1 as well. I think we pretend as though technology is hard, but there's never actually a real discussion of what magic can do and what it can't do. And in the end, the main limitation is if you overuse magic, it kind of warps reality. But none of it's really ever explained in detail. It's never like, oh, you need a big power core to power a big machine, or the teleportation system only works if whatever, right? Or these specific runes need to be used. Hextech gets slightly more because there's that time with the Hex Matrix where they're talking about how these runes kind of are used to channel magic. But I think generally it's actually kind of more like a setting that pretends to have hard magic and technology systems, but if you think about it, the rules never really matter. So that's kind of my take.
God damn it! Guess what? Guess.
You rate it the same way.
Well, I mean, I don't. We just came up with a rating, but I basically just agree with you.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even say it. I wouldn't say the setting pretends that it's hard when it's not. In the sense that the rating, the magic is like there is a system to it in internally, but they never go out of their way to explain us the rules. So I would never say that it pretends to be hard. It just tells us that there is an internal consistency to it that we are not privy to, because it doesn't matter for the story.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah, it's
not
kind of
oh, you can only
it's kind of
shoot
like
the
because there's a
hex gun 3
science.
times.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's because it feels like there's like a science of it. It's like they kind of imply there are rules and there are specific technical limitations, right, to the powers, but we're never really introduced. And like those drawbacks never really matter. There's never a moment where the hammer fails, like Jace's hammer fails because he forgot it to squam the Scooby-Doo, right, before the fight or something,
Yeah, but I would also say that like the magic in Arcane
and I
much.
think also, sorry, I also think the problems in Arcane reflect that. The problems in Arcane are mostly interpersonal conflicts, right? It's not like, oh, we need to get to the top of Mount Doom. How do we do it? Oh, I have this glider. That's how we do it. The problem is like, how do we get these two societies to get along, right? Or how do I, that kind of thing.
Yeah, like the magic system, like the magic drives the story and is there to create an aesthetic and a certain feeling, but it doesn't actually meaningfully solve the problems. If anything, it just creates more of them.
It's not fully a backdrop though, right? Like you wouldn't say.
No. I said it drives the story. Like it drives
I know.
The story.
I'm just saying. I'm like going through it in my head. I'm not saying that you said this. I'm just saying like it doesn't go so far as to just like simply become a backdrop like Star Wars, where it's kind of like, oh, it's just the aesthetic. Like the fact that the technology is new and is here is important to the narrative, and it creates many of the problems, but it doesn't solve them in a sense.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the right way to say it.
Yeah, I think there's two wonderful examples for Hextech being soft. One is when Jace and Vi in season 1 go at the chem tank and start like taking lives. And the fact that Jace is out of control, and that that the violence that he's bringing to this place, the senseless violence that he's bringing to this place, is manifested in like the big ass hammer that he has opening up and becoming a cannon. And like, what? The hammer becomes a cannon. Who designed this? And of course Jace designed this, but it's an escalation, right? He made a hammer which is kind of related to his identity, and as a family whose whole deal is producing hammers and producing tools, and then the hammer becomes a gun. That's the emotional arc that Jace is going through, and then he shoots a kid. And similarly, but in a positive way, Echo and several characters, but especially Echo, tell Vi that Vi still blocks with the face. Vi is very self-destructive in fighting. She just kind of like, she goes for the punch and she doesn't care if she gets hit. She is very happy to take punches. And that's in her final fight with Sevika, which is her mini boss before the big dinner with family dinner, let's call it. She initially gets
bad
wrecked.
Thanksgiving is what I call that.
Yeah.
See?
She gets the second worst Thanksgiving you've ever attended.
Exactly.
Vi is getting her ass whooped by Sevika, and the moment that she wins is when she blocks, and suddenly her gauntlets manifest a shield. The
Oh,
shield comes out
interesting.
of nowhere. We have never seen it, but all of a sudden, there's an anti-gravity shield around her, which
Mm,
makes sense in the sense that they have told us as the gloves that she's wearing. Jace
mm,
designed them for like miners.
yeah,
And so it's like, oh, this shield would be for like miners. If like suddenly the mine starts collapsing, you activate the shield and the anti-gravity keeps the debris from falling on your head.
yeah.
I love Jace, the simple minded, the single neuron in his head. Big gloves that punch strong. Miners will make use of this. We'll say this will help people.
Yeah,
But yeah, anyways. But like from that point of view, it's like, oh, that's why there is the shield. But of course, they've never set it up. It comes out of
yeah,
nowhere and it saves Vi's ass. But Vi is actually fighting more in a more smart way. She's not throwing herself completely at Sevika. She's literally blocking, which like an episode ago is what um Echo remarked on. She said you block with your face, and then instead she blocks for real, and then she gets rewarded with a cool power that she never uses again. We never see it again. But it stuns Sevika midair, and then Vi literally grabs her arm and rips it off her.
Yeah, I think also like Arcane kind of highlights this in how it is as a show. Arcane is great at creating interpersonal conflict and drama that feels believable and grips you. It's not really great at giving you satisfying payoffs for like mysteries and that kind of thing. You know? So like I feel like the technology, because it's not very well described, you also see that it's not often used to like solve a lot. Like Shimmer, nobody makes antidepressants from Shimmer that work on Jinx, right? Or something like that. You know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
um, um. So like, I think, and it probably only gets worse in season 2. But I think also, one of
Oh
the
yeah, don't get me
weaknesses
started on season 2. We already have
I
a
think
pod
one
for
of the
that.
weaknesses of Arcane is that um because they don't really ever set up like a very plausible or very nuanced magic system, or like they don't set, sorry, that's not what I meant. I didn't mean it like that. What I mean is because they never set up like rules for their technology and magic system, they can't use it much to solve problems, and when they do to use it to solve problems, it's kind of like black, it's kind of whatever. It's like, oh, okay, I guess they can do this, and I guess they can fix this, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, I guess Jinx can make this really cool arm. All right. It's not like, um like mind blowing or something like
Yeah.
that. It's not like, oh wow, yeah, that's exactly paid off. That's exactly how they set it up.
Yeah.
So it's
Like
maybe
it.
even something that the writers of Arcane could have used is this idea that, like, if you want to pay off and solve something in a clever way with your magic or technology, then you need to break it down for us. You need to spend some time telling us exactly what it can and can't do, rather than just giving us like Rune Matrix technobabble.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. The next one, I don't know if we will disagree much about it,
Mm-hmm.
just because I'm not very knowledgeable of this franchise, but you are, and I want to hear your take.
Oh, interesting.
It's another franchise that purports to be built upon strong scientific foundations, at least for the time.
Mm-hmm.
Star Trek.
Star Trek. Okay, yeah. I mean, I think Star Trek uses extremely hard world building, but suffers from the multi-author, multi-generation trying to tell episodic stories problem, where throwaway lines that serve as setting the emotional tone in one episode suddenly are really important in another episode. So like, is Star Trek always 100% consistent, and does it always 100% make sense? No. I think Star Trek violates the second rule, for example. They give humanity very, very, very many powers, and all of a sudden realize later on, once they've given humanity all these powers, they have very little restrictions on them. But overall, I would still say Star Trek is like a 4 or 5 out of 5. And I would put it at 4 out of 5. But I would say Star Trek has very hard world building and is mostly very consistent with the rules that it sets through its technology and its magic system. But I would say it violates some of the other rules. Like, it's not super intuitive. it's not very deep. It's often like, oh, there's a technology that can do this, and there's a different, completely unrelated technology that can do this. They're both powered by science, but
Yeah.
other than that, there's nothing that really connects them. So I would say
Yeah,
it's
but I
not
think yeah.
it's not the super deepest, and it does sometimes lack meaningful restrictions, and so they have to create arbitrary restrictions to make individual episodes work. But I would say overall, it is definitely a hard system.
Yeah. Well, just to be clear, like the idea that a system is hard or not hard doesn't mean that it must follow rules 2 or 3. It really mostly
Absolutely.
relates to 1.
Yeah,
So, for example, I was thinking also of like the way that their teleporters work, the way that their the phasers work, like all the technology that they use consistently throughout episode always works the same way. It doesn't do the thing that it needs to do this time, right?
Yes, exactly. And the way that the transporters work, they have a lot of fun with that, right? And they make different episodes where the problem and the solution are transporters and certain modifications. And so I am not. Yeah, I mean, the point I was trying to make was not that the other things detract from it being a hard system, but just that they detract from some of the satisfaction that you might get from it. And like one of the interesting things is in Star Trek Discovery, for example, they introduce a major limitation to the world building, which is that FTL travel stops working.
You told me about that.
Yeah, and so that really let them make a story that was like more interesting with more stakes, and then they paid it off in a really bad way. But that's whatever. Those are the writers of Discovery's fault.
Is Discovery the one with the girl boss war criminal?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Do you know that they made a movie about her?
Yes, I know.
I told you about it. Yeah, it's Suicide Squad. She's the leader.
Hate it. For those who don't know, they visit an alternate reality in which Earth is not like a member of the Federation of Planets. Instead, it's like the Terran Empire, and they're like human supremacists who've conquered most of the galaxy or whatever. And she's like the emperor of the empire, so she's literally the person at the top calling the shots. And most of the time, the show is just like, "Yas, queen, girl, boss, go do it to him, go kill him," right? Because she's like helping the people from the alternate reality who are obviously uncomfortable with her, but like they treat her like as though she's basically an anti-hero, right? And it's like, guys, this is like alternate reality Hitler. She's like a human supremacist. She's like literally a racist she's literally the racist leader of an empire that she rules with an iron fist. Like, it's like so bad. I don't think this should be your anti-hero. Like, pick anybody else, please.
Yeah, it would be very funny if they just like picked gender bend Hitler and they just had Hitler on the thing in, the uniform and all. And they're like, oh Hitler, you and your gritty moral. He doesn't play by the rules. He's such a lone wolf.
Exactly.
He gets things done.
It's so crazy. Because like people are like, yeah, exactly. Like the show never treats it as critically as it should, right? Because this character is just too much fun, right? They had too much fun with this character, and the actress just portrayed the character in a really compelling and interesting way.
Michelle Yeoh?
Yes, exactly.
Oh my god.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it's like, yeah, okay, of course it's like, I know that it feels good, but what you're doing here is super weird, right? Like you set up this character really badly to fill this niche in later episodes by having her be the leader of a racist empire.
Yeah.
You really should have done her, somehow differently if you wanted to have an anti-hero character like this. Right? The problem isn't the character. The problem is what you do to the morals of your show by letting this person be that character.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
things are gonna get real when Captain Kirk and Spock must join forces with Mao Zedong.
Exactly. Exactly. So I think, Star Trek has a very hard world building system. They use things pretty consistently. Like there are parts of the world building system that are like inconsistent or just work because they need them to work. But long running franchise, standard issue. I do think that like generally speaking, phasers always work the same, and we know how phasers work. They have different levels, and they work in different ways. And the teleporters work the same way. The ship needs to know where you are to teleport you, so they can't just teleport you from anywhere. And if somebody steals your communicator and isolates you, then you can't teleport back. And that's a standard issue. Or communicators can be blocked. by things being in the way or there being like distance issues. So yeah, I would say Star Trek hard world building, 4 out of 5.
Yeah. All right. Here's
All
an
right.
interesting one. Another sci-fi one.
Mm-hmm.
The Foundation.
Huh.
Yeah. It's interesting. So the interesting thing to me is that the magic system that gets introduced in Foundation that is central to the story is psychohistory.
Yeah.
But the whole deal of psychohistory is that like it's not something that you're supposed to use. It's just something that exists and it stands there and it looks pretty. And you need to hope that you're not striving too much away from the prediction.
Yeah. The thing with psychohistory is it is solving one big problem, which is the whole series. And so you don't really know if it works or if it doesn't work, or if it solved the problem or the belief in it solved the problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like, it's
absolutely.
like, if psychohistory was something that was used like over and over and over again, like, oh, our psychohistoric methods tell us we will survive the siege, and then they survive the siege, right? Or something like that, right? Our psychohistoric methods tell us they're going to attack us from that direction, and then they attack you from that direction, right?
Yeah.
Then it's like, then you could, but it's almost as it is, it's not really a magic system because it's like it solves one big problem, which is the whole series, and it's unclear, kind of, as you're until the very end. It's unclear whether or not it is actually solving the problem or not.
I think that like at least for the core 3 books, my take on it is that it works as a hard magic system in the sense that they present you with a set of rules. They claim that they're correct, and then the second book challenges them and shows the inner contradictions of the system, and then the third book gives you a logical solution that was already built into the system from the beginning, namely the second foundation, that actually makes it make sense. And then you're like, oh, all right, it made sense all along, and I could have thought of this because as we did our third episode, we already talked about how, like, if you really think about it, psychohistory doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And then the third book tells you, yes, you are right to think that, and here's why. In the book, it makes sense that there's a second foundation that is actually directing things so that psychohistory works out after all.
So the thing with the second foundation that I don't like, though, is that like the power system of the second foundation is like totally, in my opinion, soft world building. Like, it's never established what exactly this power of psychology can and can't do. In fact, it seems pretty close to all powerful, raising for me the question of why the second foundation ever was the backup plan. Seems to me like it should have been the plan. Like, I feel like the plan was bad. Like, plan A sucked and plan B works way better. Like, of course, if you have the power of mind control, it's more likely that you can forge an empire on that basis. Seems to me like that's what...
I mean, okay, so I think that if you start going into like that kind of like sci-fi stuff, we go back to the topic of like historical cultural context. But I was talking about specifically psychohistory. But I mean, we can talk about the psychic stuff. I think that like after psychic stuff has been introduced, it's not a surprise to me that like Foundation 2 can do all that kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, it makes sense. That, you know, I think that about your question, I think the thing is you need Foundation 1 because the first Foundation are the ones concerned with like all the technology that you actually need to run an empire. Like, the second foundation can do all their fancy stuff, but they can't figure out, like, FTL. They don't know how nuclear power works. The first foundation knows how nuclear power works. So the first foundation is like, I think, you know, like,
just
you can
like have specialists within one organization, right? Have the division of mind control gods and have the division of everybody else and make it one foundation. Why seed them on opposite ends of the galaxy and create this potential fail case where the first foundation doesn't manage to reach out to the second foundation in time to save it from marauding mule characters, right? Like,
I mean, you can argue. I think one of the things that it has is basically, and that also kind of makes sense with your critique, is like, why would you want to be, if you could choose, why would you want to be a nuclear scientist when you can be a mind control person? Everyone would want to be the mind control person, because otherwise you can never trust yourself ever, right? So like in
Yeah.
the second foundation, they're all psychic.
Yeah.
And I think being a normal person in the second foundation would be awful. It would be like being a dog,
Yeah.
but like being aware that you're a dog. I mean, like not
But
happy
in
about it.
terms of hard world building,
Mhm.
right? I think like FTL travel consistently does not exist, and like travel consistently works the same way. Like
Oh, wait,
general
I think that
technology.
FTL exists in Foundation.
No, it's wormholes.
Okay, sorry. Okay, but that is FTL. I mean, you're not literally
Well,
traveling
okay,
faster
it's
than the
not
speed
like
of light, but
yeah.
we are using a sci-fi concept that lets you travel from point A to point B faster than light would travel between those two
Yeah.
points.
The point is that consistently works like that way, right? Like I'm trying to think about like the actual technology of the setting, right? Like nuclear warheads are consistently like one of the pinnacles of warfare,
And I
right?
think in that
Like
series, like technology is paradoxically not like very interesting for Asimov to
mm,
explore, because he's more concerned with like setting up the sociological reasons why the
yeah.
Foundation will survive this crisis.
Is in your opinion, is it a satisfying payoff? The second
Mm,
foundation. I
I
feel like it's not, specifically in exactly the way that Brandon's first rule tells you not to make it. We don't know anything about the second foundation. So, or their power set, or how that version of psychology works. And because we don't know how any of that works, when they come and solve the final problem, is it really satisfying?
mm, I think the final payoff of Second Foundation, spoiler incoming, is the moment where the people of the first foundation are debating where the second foundation is located, right? That's the big final moment of tension, is where is the second foundation? And they propose several ways of computing what the opposite end of the galaxy would be. And then they kind of come to the conclusion that like the second foundation is on the first foundation. And when they do that, they devise that machine that basically would kill anyone with psychic powers on the first foundation and just fire it. And then like 40 people die on the first foundation. And then they're like, okay, we got rid of the second foundation, we are free. And then you cut to the second foundation where they're like, they're such fools, they're such physics people. They don't even think sociologically. And that Harry Seldon was not a physicist. He was a sociologist first and a mathematician second, and he was never like interested in geometry. And then the other side of the galaxy was not geometrically, but was like one of the foundations is on Terminus, the shittiest asteroid at the edge of the world, and the first one is on Trantor, the core of the galaxy, the opposite planet in terms of sociology. Like what's the furthest apart sociologically you could be from a little asteroid is the core of the Imperium itself. So to me, that was like cool, and it didn't like in terms of psychohistory. It's like, yeah, it makes sense, but I agree with you that it feels a little bit like ramming a ship in faster than light travel into another ship. It's like, yeah, technically that's correct, but that's not what you told me this would be. At the same time, as I said before, what Asimov told us psychohistory would be was inconsistent, and as we talked about before, doesn't really work. Like psychohistory doesn't really work. And then the second foundation, second book explains that error, and then the third book kind of like shows you how Harry Seldon had predicted even that. And to me, that works. But like you have to read them one after the other, as like, which is what I did, as like one extended thing.
I disagree. I disagree in the end. Like,
hey, we did it. We did
yeah,
it.
like your ability to solve a problem with magical psychology powers depends on your ability to foreshadow that magical psychology powers are a thing and that they exist in this setting and how exactly they work. And the part of the problem is that the mule has it through a mutation, but the psychologists have it through training and study. So, like, if the mule had his powers because he was a psychologist who had somehow cracked this science, I think it would all be way more satisfying. Because you'd be like, oh, the mule has mastered psychohistory and is using it to conquer the galaxy. But Harry Seldon probably predicted that. Here's a whole bunch of people with these same powers who could solve it. And you go, okay, yes, it all makes sense. But because the mule just has it on accidentally, and his powers and the powers of the Foundation are never really like fully explained how an analysis of psychology gives you mind control powers, like how that really works. I find in the end that it kind of comes a little bit out of nowhere. And I think, like, for me, especially when I was reading it the first time, I was like, psychohistory just sounds like predictive history. What does psycho have anything to do with it? And then the longer you get in the history, into the books, I really felt like he just called this psychohistory because he wanted to also talk about history and psychology. But these are like not related fields. And like these are not related executions of the field, right? Like, psychologically understanding a patient doesn't allow you to predict the future of society, and the future of society has nothing really to do with understanding the psychology of a patient. Like, it's just like two unrelated concepts. One is predictive history and the other is mind control, and nothing really genuinely connects them for me. So I feel like at the end of the day, there was not enough foreshadowing. Psychology powers were not essential to the story from the get-go, and were not foreshadowed enough for them to be the big conclusion and have it
But
be
are you
satisfying, in
saying
my
that it's a
opinion.
hard magic system that was executed poorly, or would you say that it
Yes.
makes it a okay?
Yeah.
So we just agreed that it's a hard magic system.
Yeah, but what I
Like-
was saying, I was trying to raise another question. I was trying to raise the question of, but is it satisfying though?
Mhm.
Did they do
Yeah.
it? Did he do it right? Did he pay it
Mhm.
off right? And I would come to
Yeah.
the conclusion it's mostly a hard magic system.
Mhm.
But like, it's not done very well. Like the payoff is not the payoff is not done quite right because we don't really get into the rules of like the psychology powers and for them to be the final conclusions of the series. So I feel like it is generally more of a hard system because we're
Mhm.
explaining these rules and the system, and psychohistory works in a very specific way and it doesn't work in other ways. It has limitations that are clearly illustrated and that in fact the story is about. So I
Mhm.
do think that like it meets most of the criteria to be like fairly hard, like 3 or 4 out of 5. Like,
Mhm.
but I don't. But the further question, the secondary question,
Is it
is it
good?
satisfyingly done? Is it well done? I would say it's the second one. No, not really. Is
Mhm.
it hard? Yeah, it's more hard than soft in my opinion, by a margin. But is it satisfyingly done? Not exactly.
Yeah.
You
And
know?
I do think that the first book of Foundation is the stronger one of the three.
Yeah,
And
I
also, I
agree.
would also add, like, just throwing it in there, Foundation is a very odd kind of story.
Yeah.
Just like, in terms of like characters and plot and narrative conventions, it's just very odd altogether. But I thought it was a very interesting one to talk about because of it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting idea, executed maybe not so well.
It's not always well because it's many stories. So I also feel like, we can't talk about different stories and saying this one's good, this one's bad.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like if this is kind of very far off topic, but if you're going to start Isaac Asimov, like read iRobot first. And that is definitely a very hard system.
Yeah, I had it on my list, but then I was like, what are we talking about? What's there to debate? It's on the front page.
It's got 3 rules. It starts out with 3 rules, and we go from there.
Yeah. I was about to say, actually, before you brought this up, pretty ironic that Asimov fails at following a set of 3 rules.
Yeah.
with Foundation, like the.
I mean, the whole
rules
point
of,
is that, right? The whole point is not that these 3 rules, like he takes these 3 rules, which claim they make robots safe, and shows how robots are still not safe. It's not that he takes these 3 rules and claims that they produce a completely consistent world, and then he proves himself inconsistent and to be a soft world builder, right?
No.
The only
Sorry,
thing that
what
he
I meant
disproves with his story is that the rules make a robot safe. Everything else is still internally consistent and very hard world building style, where like the
Yeah.
rules matter and like, you know, all of that stuff of how robots work matters
Yeah.
in his setting. And if it was a different setting, like, you couldn't solve the problems in the same way.
Psst, that's what makes I Have Robot the movie bad. We should talk about it sometime.
I've never seen it, so
Good
we'd have
for
to
you.
watch it first.
It's not very good. It's no, actually, what I said is like I was talking about the Brandon Sanderson's 3 laws, and I said it's pretty funny because you said that you brought up how Foundation fails. I was like, pretty ironic that Asimov fails to follow those 3 rules. Okay, final one. This one's a fun one, and another topic dear to this podcast. So we had one to start, one to close. D&D.
D&D. When it comes to the spell system, D&D is the hardest magic system I know. You basically need to understand a textbook of information in order to fully understand how things interact. And people who, like, year-long practitioners make regular mistakes. That's how intricate and complex and like how rules oriented it is, right? There's exact rules for how it works. However, there is magic in D&D that I would say is much softer. Like, if you just read through the Dungeon Master's Guide about like how the planes work and how the gods work, right? There's no explanation offered for why the gods don't just like fix all the problems all the time. Like, all of that is sort of just like, that's up to the DM, it's up to your imagination. You kind of get to decide if there's rules there that dictate that, and if those rules exist, why they exist, and if they don't exist, why they don't exist, or whatever, you know. That's all up to you. And then like how demons work, right? That's like all still like demons work however the vibe needs them to work, basically, you know. Like, there's all different kinds of demons, they're all infinite, and there's, you know, if they ever want a supplement and they need a demon and none of the demons from the book fits, they'll make up a new one in a heartbeat, right? So I would say there are elements of D&D that have like more soft world building to them, but the system that the players interact with, spell casting, is very, very hard. System, like 5 out of 5. If that's not a 5, I don't know what is, right? Like, at that point the scale becomes meaningless if that's not a 5. So
my take is that D&D is asymmetrical in its magic system, but the asymmetry exists between the player and the dungeon master.
Yeah.
The player has to follow a very specific set of rules, as you said, for spells or spell-like magical abilities that allow you to do certain things a certain number of days with very clearly defined boundaries. And then the dungeon master basically can do whatever they want.
Yeah.
Like, people always bring out the example of the necromancer. If you're playing a necromancer wizard, the class doesn't allow you to become a lich or raise an army of undead. But there is nowhere should a dungeon master be withheld by the limitations set upon a necromancer player character to prevent their big bad evil guy to raise an army of undead, because what are we even talking about?
Actually, Theia, I can use the wish spell to become a lich and raise an army of undead.
Well, actually, I could say no, because I'm the DM. So, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting point. You bring there is an interesting point, and maybe you raise one of the reason why wish is such a. I mean, there's so many reasons or so many ways you could phrase it, but you could also say that the wish spell kind of breaks the asymmetry by letting the players kind of like use magic in a soft way where it can kind of do whatever they want. But of course, the DM can use that because the DM is making the story happen, and the player is trying to abuse the system to make whatever they want to happen with their resources, in a way.
And hey, wait, is this a crazy thought? But does Wish make it hard for you to create satisfying challenges, problems for your characters to solve as a DM?
If only there were a set of rules I could reference. Like, if there was a rule, I would feel like this would be a rule too.
If there was an expert out there,
if there was a set of 3 rules written by an expert out there, what number would this be? I think 2 feels like the correct answer. Yeah. So I think there is an asymmetry. You brought up, for example, that it's kind of soft, talking about like how angels work, how demons work, you know. There are some rules for that, but the setting is kind of vague about it, and I think that's because that's DM magic. The dungeon master can uses that magic. But when it comes to players summoning demons, the spells are very careful about what you can do exactly. So even in the case of demons, it's not only that demons operate on a different magic system, that when the player interacts, like does demon magic, the rules are set very clearly, and when the DM wants to use demons, he can do whatever he wants. They can do whatever they want.
And it's also often unclear, like for a monster, like if a feature they're using is a part of the magic system of spells, right? Like when a demon dies and reforms in the abyss, it says it on the stat block that happens, but it's like, well, does that happen in an anti-magic zone?
I was about to bring it up, yeah.
Does that happen if can I counterspell it? Is it a spell, right? And it's like kind of unclear. Like, I would say you can't counterspell it because it's not a spell, but does it happen in an anti-magic zone? I don't know. Does a demon stop existing in an anti-magic zone? And so, like, that's like, because there's uncertainty of interpretation there, it shows that it's like a softer aspect, right? Like, also people talk about it as like a dragon. It's like a dragon's breath. Is that magical? Maybe. Is it a spell? No, right? And so it's like there's like a lot of flexibility in there. I think you're right. There's a lot of flexibility in there for the DM. And I think that's fun. I'm fond of the idea of there being like I like the kind of Aragon approach where there's a system of magic that's very rigid and industrialized, and this is what and like systematized, and this is what humans use because humans don't like chaos. But it's all the structured channeling of a primal force, which can kind of have soft magic bullshit happen, right?
Yeah,
or like you can have spirits or whatever, or like a mountain that shoots fire, and that's not like a 5th level spell or something. It's just like, well, spells are how people interact with magic, but magic is a force that can be used in these other soft ways that are fun.
Yeah, and it's also to bring it back to video game design. Like when you bring it to video game design, it becomes obvious. Like as the main character, as the player, if you're playing an RPG, you can customize your character and like pick different abilities from a set system. But then the developer can just make the monsters do whatever they want.
Yeah, and like you need to have a set system because it's often more flexible. Like like the monster does whatever it wants, but it only does it in that one way. It never uses it in a combination with 7 other features, and each fight is play tested on its own. So like that it works, right? Whereas the player often has like a combinatorics of features available to them that you could never test every possible combination, so it needs like rules and stuff to keep it like more consistent and balanced. And that's like often the problem with player given homebrew is there's a certain type of player that like offer you homebrew that they're just trying to combo with something else and they don't tell you that. And then, it's like they're trying to use the softness of the role of the DM is that, you just get to make up whatever and combine it with like, oh, but this thing lets me do this. And if you combine those 2 features, then it's like totally bananas.
It's like, totally... you fool DM, you didn't think about how my Aarakocra lineage would interact with the Blood Whip. It's like, okay, I'm taking the Blood Whip away then. And it's like, no, why? Tyrannical DM.
Yeah, and so I think there are systems, though, where magic is much softer on the player side, but those are kind of more rules lights, go with the flow kind of systems, and they still have rules, but there are still, like, even amongst games, there are, like, more interpretative magic systems, where it's like, you produce a minor magical effect that has about this scale and can affect about this many creatures, and you and the DM kind of have to work it out. But yeah, anyways.
All right. I think
we've got almost 2 hours of content
we've
here.
Got it. I think we're done. I think we're done. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thanks for discussing this with me.
Yeah,
I think it was.
I had a great time.
It was an interesting. Thank you. And do you have?
May this improve all the world building of all of our listeners.
Yes. Hi.
Do you have any plugs this week?
Do I have any plugs this week? Let's see. I do not, I think. Do you?
Okay. Yes. I played a card game with my family recently. It's called Skyo or Skyjo, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It's a fun card game. It's like one of these card games where you have cards in front of you that are like some of them face down, some of them face up. and you're drawing cards from a pile, and you're like trying to replace the cards in front of you that are face down and face up, to like minimize your overall total points, right? And so like you'll draw a card off the pile, and let's say you draw 3 off the pile, and you're like, ooh, is a 3 going to be lower than my face down card? Who knows? And then you turn it over and you find out, right? Or you replace one of your face up cards that are like safer to replace. And as the game progresses, more and more of your cards get turned face up, so you get more and more information about the game state as the game progresses. And
Interesting.
I thought it was fun. I thought it was a fun, simple game, which is hard to do, right? Like a game that you can explain in 5 minutes, but has a depth of strategy and interest. And I think this game really does it in a simple way. So if you get the chance or you want to, go play some Skyjo. You can do it with a normal set of playing cards. Like there is a specific Skyjo deck, but to be honest, having played it, you don't need it. You could do this with a 52 set of playing cards. And I'm sure there's like people on Reddit who've made an adaptation of the rules that work with that. You know, just pretend an ace is a 1, and then, you know, a jack is an 11, and a queen is a 12, and a king is a 13. And you could mostly play the exact same game as Skyjo. You don't need the game, but the game obviously probably enhances it to some degree. But yeah, anyways, that's my plug for this week.
I actually have a plug. Since we're talking about games, did I already plug Nidavellir?
I don't think so. Know.
I don't think so. All right. Nidavellir is a board game. The name is exactly like the realm of Norse mythology, of dwarves. And it's a game about building a dwarf army to face the dragon Fafnir. The game involves no combat. Make no mistake, some people were tricked by the cover to think it would be a combat game. It's a math game. It's a math game where you need to build up the power of your dwarven army by recruiting dwarves of different factions. There is hunters, there's fighters, there is scouts, there is builders, and there is miners. And the interesting thing is that every faction that you recruit from, the way that you score points from them essentially increases by a different mathematical formula. So you have to kind of like work with what you're given by the game, by building up your army, and you want to figure out how to maximize your ultimate number of points. For example, hunters, their power grows quadratically with the number of hunters you have. And with the warriors, it's more linear, but warriors are cheaper. And it's a lot of fun. And there's also a betting aspect to it, because when you get to, instead of just going in turns to pick which dwarves to get, essentially the players need to bet a certain amount of money that they own on each pool of dwarves to pick from. And then depending on on who bets the most money, you get to go first, second, or third, or fourth in order. So betting more money from an interesting pool is good. But of course, if it's an interesting pool, more people will bet more money on it. So you have to kind of gauge who will bet how much to not waste all your money. It's kind of, there's a betting aspect to it. It's very math heavy. And if you like math, I had so much fun.
That's awesome.
Yeah. All right.
Well, alrighty. That'll just about do it for our 22nd episode. If you want more, you can find us on youtube.com/@afriendlyorbit, as well as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you happen to have any Astral Echoes you want to share with us, you can email us at afriendlyorbit@gmail.com. All one word.
Okay, Ceres, I'll talk to you later. And to all of our fellow Voyagers, we will catch you out there amongst the stars, where you're breathing with your spacesuit that we set up in the beginning of the episode, because it's a hard magic system only place. I said it was hard in the beginning. I said it up.
But you didn't set up the suit. No, you broke all of the laws. Well, maybe not the third one.
And the 0th law, which is that I'm awesome. Bye.
What? How is...